Hey everybody, welcome back to another quick view of AP World History. Today we're going to be talking about the end of communism, specifically in the Soviet Union and China. And I suppose maybe end is a little bit misleading because in China, technically the Communist Party still exists. So I'll clarify that in just a little bit. But we'll be talking about kind of the factors that went into the collapse of the communist world and why those things were significant. So, uh, Part of the way that communist governments began coming to an end was the role of popular movements. Now, before the 1970s, a lot of these movements were usually pretty brutally suppressed, especially under Stalin. Although Khrushchev and Mao, Khrushchev was a Soviet leader and Mao was the leader of China, you do see some brutal suppression of popular movements under those leaders as well. Um, but starting in the 70s up until 1991, a lot of these popular movements would eventually succeed in overthrowing their communist governments, particularly in Europe. So that was going to play a role. Another factor that played a role in the failure of communism and the end of communism was that communism didn't really work long term economically. In the cases of China and in the Soviet Union, there was a lot of stagnation, and the communist governments really struggled to keep up, and they could never really catch up in their economic capacity or in their military capacity. So that's pretty important. And in both cases, the Soviets and the Chinese will try to take steps to alleviate that concern, but they go about it in completely different ways. And that's actually really important. So we'll go over that. And then also the moral failures that stained communism. And just to kind of help you understand this, communism had widely been seen as a liberating movement, especially in regards to women's equality and stuff like that. A lot of people were trying to argue that communism was a morally superior system, and things like the purges and the terror under Stalin, as well as Mao's Cultural Revolution, proved that that was not true. It was really no better than Western culture in that regard in terms of morality. And so all of these things will play a role in smaller or larger ways. Um, we'll start with China because China's communist movement will really kind of fall apart economically speaking first. I mean, this is where I'll have to clarify for you kind of how this works. And it really is rooted in the rise of Deng Xiaoping in China. So one of the things he'll do is he'll kind of relax a lot of the censorship laws that had previously existed, as well as releasing a lot of political prisoners that had been um, imprisoned under the Maoist regime and and during the Cultural Revolution. And what Deng Xiaoping's real claim to fame rests is in the economic reforms. So, dismantling the collective farming system was key. Opening China up to world trade was also important. But the probably the most lasting change is the development of the special economic zones, and those were important because it basically created sort of pockets of capitalism in China, though China still would claim to have been a communist state, and was still led by the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. The use of the special economic zones was their way of incorporating more free market systems in order to generate economic growth, which was really important. So, um, economically speaking, they did not remain communism. Now, politically speaking, the Chinese Communist Party remained solidly in political control of China, and that is still true today. So China gets a lot of rap for how they censor things now and kind of their relative level of repression towards democratic movements, and that is still that was under Xiaoping and still is a key feature of China. And one of the ways in which that was demonstrated was through what's called the Tiananmen Square massacre. There are videos on YouTube where you can look up the different movements that centered around and happened just before the Tiananmen Square massacre. There's a really iconic image of a Chinese man standing in front of a tank. So I would suggest you look that up. So the key here to understanding China is that, as I mentioned, economically speaking, there's a drastic change that takes place where the Chinese really, through the special economic zones, begin to embrace capitalism. And that sets China on the path towards rapid development, which results in a situation where now, here we are less than or around 44 years later, China has the fastest growing economy in the world and is the second largest economy in the world and is developing so rapidly. They are the number one consumers society in the world. Partially because of their population being well over a billion, well over 1.2 billion. That's a really important. They're a really important factor, as you may realize now. Now, Soviet communism is going to be different. So I mentioned this guy before, Mikhail Gorbachev. He became the leader beginning in the 1980s, and his job was really difficult because he had to focus on trying to fix the stagnation economically that was taking place, as well as addressing the relative level of cultural apathy and then the cynicism that was taking place in the Soviet Union. And so he's going to try two really big ideas. One of them is going to be called the perestroika, or the restructuring. And this was an effort to try to convert the Soviet economy to allow free enterprise, kind of trying to do what China did and move towards a more free market capitalistic structure of economics. However, it failed because they lacked the structure and the experience required to successfully make that transition. It just was a mess and fell apart. And so the stagnation actually got worse in the Soviet Union. And so economically, they were doing terribly. And this prevented them from being able to rival the United States during the 80s under Reagan, and how the United States was escalating the Cold War through the SDI as well as other measures. So that was a disaster for Gorbachev. And then the other really key issue had to do with something called the glasnost, which is a word that means openness. And this was an effort to permit a lot more cultural and intellectual freedom. So it was a huge reduction of censorship that took place. And when this occurred, there was an explosion of literature and journalism in the Soviet Union, kind of exposing the dark history of the Soviet Union, even going back to Stalin and earlier. A lot of the evils that were done, things about relating to the Gulag and the purges and whatnot. It exposed that, as well as exposing the fact that the Soviet Union was economically weak, which for much of the Cold War, even at times where the Soviet economy was stagnating, there was a pretty conscious effort on the part of Soviet leaders to kind of mask that. And the censorship of the press allowed them to convey an image of strength economically and militarily that they probably didn't really have, especially for the last decade or so of its existence. So these changes, they did not reverse the Soviets' downward trend, and that was problematic. So their political collapse, so their economy was already collapsing. Their political collapse begins to show in 1989. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the inability of the Soviets to really control the situation in Berlin and to really uphold kind of their side of things showed that the weaknesses and the cracks in their leadership and in their strength. And then Gorbachev initiated a period of democratization where they actually held free elections in 1989, which I think what they were trying to do was give people the choice under the assumption that all people wanted was a choice, and that if they had to choose, they would still choose the Communist Party. But there was a huge rejection in the polls of the Communist Party. And that was a really big problem. And so that began what's known as the Miracle Year in 1989. And so as movements begin to emerge, anti-Soviet movements and movements for independence, Gorbachev really made it obvious that he would refuse to crush any of the political protest, unlike his predecessors. And so these independence movements took place throughout Europe. And there was the reason why this is called the Miracle Year is because pretty much all of these movements to gain independence from the Soviet Union were successful without bloodshed and without any major conflict, which was really important. The Gorbachev's political weakness did not win him any favor among kind of more conservative or traditional Soviet leaders. And so in 1991, there was a coup that took place where they actually tried to usurp Gorbachev's power and succeeded. And what ultimately comes out of that is, and this is again simplifying, but the Soviet Union ended up getting broken up into 15 different independent states. And so this New York Times article over here is showing you the headline news story about the new commonwealths that emerged in Russia. And so these are kind of like the key points of the collapse of the communist states in China and in Russia.